Hi, this is Eric Halsey, the creator of the Bulgarian History Podcast, and you're watching a special video documentary of You've probably never heard of the First Bulgarian Empire, but it was once a dominant state in Europe, one which gave the world the Cyrillic alphabet, helped define the later centuries of Byzantine history, and perhaps the most mysterious thing about this once powerful empire is its origin. How did Bulgaria come into being? One thing we do know, it began with that most human of tendencies, migration. Great migrations have been happening almost as long as there have been humans. The ones which began the story of the Bulgarians were no different. These began with the huge migration of the Slavs from their homeland, somewhere in modern Belarus, Ukraine, possibly Poland. From around the 6th century, they had settled in the Balkans, establishing themselves well within the boundaries of the Byzantine Empire. At this time, the Bulgars had a state of their own. Known as Old Great Bulgaria, this was one in a long line of states that the Bulgars had established during their centuries-long migration from a little understood homeland, likely in Central Asia. Old Great Bulgaria existed through modern Ukraine between the Dnieper and Don rivers, as well as most of the Caucasus Mountains. It began, as with so many steppe tribe confederations, with a man uniting several Bulgar tribes under his banner, in this case one Khan Kubrat. Kubrat took the ancient city of Fanagoria, perched on an island in the Straits of Kerch, which separate the Black Sea from the Sea of Azov. But this state would be short-lived. That great womb of nations, the seemingly endless sea of grasses which stretched from the territory of Old Great Bulgaria for thousands of kilometers to the east, kept birthing new tribes which would sweep down from the steppe in search of a homeland of their own. The Bulgars were one of these tribes, but more were coming. This time it was the Khazars. Khan Kubrat may have urged his 5 sons to stay together, but he was now dead, and with overwhelming Khazar pressure coming from the east, the Bulgars resolved to take their own portions of the tribe and flee to the far corners of the world in search of a new homeland from around the year 668. Leading these groups were the sons of Kubrat. They traveled far and wide. Groups went to Lake Van in Armenia, to the upper reaches of the Volga River, to around modern Venice, to southern Italy, to the Pannonian Plain, to the deep mountains of Macedonia, and finally, to the delta of the great Danube River. Some of these sons would establish their own Bulgar states. Others would see their tribes vanish and be incorporated into other great states. But only one would establish an empire. That son was Asparuch. He, along with tens of thousands of followers, entered the territory of the mighty Byzantine Empire. Far from the first or the last steppe tribe to do so, they were, however, one of only 2 tribes which would ever come out of the steppe and build a state that would last the test of time. In the year 680, these Bulgars fought at the Battle of Ongal against a Byzantine army sent to crush them. Neither army could have imagined that this was but the first of 45 major battles that they would fight over the next 6.5 centuries. The Byzantines certainly couldn't have imagined that their loss to the Bulgars on that marshy island would allow the establishment of a state which would help define the remainder of their history. The Bulgars then swept down into the Danubian plain, defeating the Byzantines again and forcing them to accept Bulgar presence. In 681, the Byzantines reluctantly signed a treaty recognizing the newly formed Bulgarian Khaganate and paying it annual tribute. Now, the new state faced a challenge: to establish itself as something more than another historical footnote, to build a lasting state, as so few steppe peoples had ever managed to do, and to do it all with a constant Byzantine menace, waiting patiently for the moment to destroy them once and for all. That meant building more than an empire. It meant building a nation. An identity which could withstand war, conquest, oppression, and indignities of all kinds. The Bulgars on their own simply weren't large enough to do this. Like their contemporaries, the Avars and the Khazars, they were a small elite which ruled over a large mass of foreigners. There's no country of the Avars or Khazars today for a reason. Both failed to forge a coherent nation, to become anything more than that ruling elite. But for the moment, there were wars to fight, territory to secure. The larger project of turning the Khaganate of the Bulgars into the Empire Bulgaria would have to wait. Bulgaria became a player in Byzantine politics almost right away. Within just 2 decades of the foundation of the state, Asparuch was dead, and his son was helping the exiled Byzantine Emperor Justinian II retake his throne in exchange for territory, gifts, and titles. Among these titles was Caesar, making the Bulgarian Khan the first foreign ruler to ever be given this Byzantine designation, as well as making him second only to the emperor himself in the hierarchy of Byzantine titles. But it wasn't all good feelings, as Justinian soon violated the peace agreement, leading to yet another catastrophic defeat for Byzantine arms at the First Battle of Anchialus. But just a few years later, the Byzantines found themselves in need of Bulgar assistance as a massive Arab army crossed into Europe and laid siege to Constantinople. In 2 large engagements, the Bulgars crushed the Arab armies at the walls of the city and put a halt to the advance of Islam into Europe for the next several centuries. Though it may not be as famous as the victory of the Franks at Tours, this was just as vital an engagement in the history of Europe. Soon after, the Bulgars once again played the role of emperor-maker in Constantinople, though less successfully. In any case, within a very short period, the Bulgars had managed to establish themselves as a powerful force on the Balkan Peninsula and integral to the ever-changing world of Byzantine politics. Following an intense early period, Bulgaria and Byzantium signed a peace treaty, and things would go quiet for several decades, with some brief intervals of mild fighting and a few raids here and there. But all of that ended in 755 when the peace treaty expired and war returned. The Byzantines were feeling confident as a result of their significant victory against the Arabs. Emperor Constantine V invaded, defeating the Bulgars at the First Battle of Marseille. But the Bulgars were resilient, and as the Byzantines made war on them year after year, winning many small victories, the Bulgars never relented. This continued until the Bulgarians managed to trap a Byzantine army in a mountain pass and completely destroy it, a tactic which would serve them well over the centuries. However, when the Khan decided to sue for peace, instead of continuing to take the fight to the enemy, he was murdered by his more warlike nobles who disagreed with his strategy. The next Khan, Telets, was also murdered following his disastrous defeat by the Byzantines at the Second Battle of Anchialus. This was a result of desertion on the part of the Bulgar Slavic infantry, once again highlighting the need to eventually merge the Bulgar nobility and its cavalry with that great mass of Slavs which made up the majority of the population. Khan Sabin, who took over from the murdered Telets, immediately made himself unpopular by secretly seeking peace with the Byzantines. When things got ugly, he fled to the Byzantine court and stayed there. The pattern which was developing was that the fierce independence of the Bulgar nobility demanded war, plunder, and victory over the Byzantines. The idea of making peace, or, in their words, becoming slaves to the Byzantines, was abhorrent to them. They were proud and entirely unwilling to compromise. That stubborn pride, however, made it quite difficult to run a young state in a complicated neighborhood. Military might couldn't save Bulgaria forever. Clever diplomacy was going to be necessary for them to survive. But for that to happen, the Khans were going to have to exert their power over their nobles, not the other way around. The next several Khans also faced rebellion and were either killed or fled to the Byzantine Empire. Now, during this period of chaos, the Byzantines had even managed to burn the Bulgar capital of Pliska to the ground. Clearly, internal divisions were bringing the young state closer and closer to destruction. What it needed was a strong leader. But that would take time, and meanwhile, war continued, losses mounted, and more Khans fled. It was only in the late 8th century, after decades of weak leadership and military defeats, that a Khan named Kardam came to the throne. Kardam took an aggressive policy, attacking the Byzantines before they could come to him. The result was a series of victories, which resulted in the signing of a peace treaty and the return of Byzantine tribute. But it was nothing compared to what was to come. Kardam had brought stability back to Bulgaria, stopped the bleeding caused by the weakness of his predecessors. Now, his successor, Krum, exploded onto the scene, doubling the size of the Bulgar state in just 11 years. He began by destroying the Avar Khaganate once and for all, taking enormous swaths of territory north of the Carpathians, as far north as Pest, half of modern Budapest. Within a year or two, Krum swerved around and attacked the Byzantines along the Struma Valley, taking the major city of Serdica, the city we now know as Sofia. The emperor was not amused, and responded by moving north and sacking the Bulgar capital at Pliska, taking immense amount of treasure and prisoners. However, on his way home, Krum had prepared an ambush in the mountains. When the trap closed, it was clear that the Byzantines had no way to escape the pass at Vrbica. The entire army, along with the emperor himself, perished there. It was one of the worst defeats the Byzantines had ever suffered, and the first time an emperor had been killed in battle since the Battle of Adrianople in 378. That Krum turned the fallen emperor's skull into a drinking cup only added to the shame. But that was only the beginning. Krum kept up the pressure, taking more and more Byzantine fortresses and pressing the emperor for a favorable peace. However, the Byzantines knew they couldn't accept peace in a situation like this. So they fought on. 2 more emperors were forced from their thrones by Krum's victories and relentless attacks. That is, until one Leo the Armenian came to power. This new emperor offered peace in an in-person meeting, but instead ambushed Krum with archers and tried unsuccessfully to kill him. Needless to say, Krum was furious and turned his anger into action. He plundered and took prisoners as never before and spent the winter preparing to take the ultimate prize, Constantinople. However, as he approached the final steps in his attack, he died and was succeeded by his son Omurtag, after a brief period of chaos in which several men took the reins of power. But his reign was about more than war. He also made significant progress in establishing a more stable and predictable state, something Bulgaria desperately needed, and that, in part, is Krum's legacy. Now, the country may have been exhausted, but Krum gave Bulgaria confidence and solid institutions on which it could rely. It was now just over 130 years since the country had been established, and it was finally on its way to becoming a respected player on the European stage. But Omurtag knew Bulgaria needed to breathe, and so he signed a 30-year peace treaty and set about solidifying the progress his father had made, both in terms of territory and administrative reforms. While some fighting was necessary to put down rebellions of Slavic tribes, again reinforcing the idea that the formation of a cohesive Bulgarian identity and population was necessary, these 30 years were a period of internal work. Omurtag gave the state more formal administrative structures. He also unified the army, eliminating the previous division between Bulgar cavalry and Slavic infantry. He rebuilt the capital as well as many border fortresses, and all of this contributed significantly to the forging of that identity I keep mentioning. Bulgaria was feeling less and less like a cognate ruled by a warrior elite and more like a centrally governed European empire. However, this peaceful period came to an end when Omertag's son Malamir came to the throne. With the expiration of the peace treaty, war with Byzantium resumed. Malamir was successful in his fights with Byzantium, managing to annex Philippopolis, modern Plovdiv. But internal conflicts began to cause friction within the elite of the Bulgar state, namely Christianity. Several members of Malamir's family had converted as well as many nobles. Embrace of or resistance to Christianity was emerging as a major point of conflict amongst them. Some saw Christianity as the truth faith as well as a way for Bulgaria to truly join the ranks of major European powers. Others saw it as the fast track towards Byzantine cultural and ultimately military domination. Under the next Khan, Presyan, most of the major policy was determined by the sort of prime minister, a man named Izbul. The main development during Presyan's 16 years on the throne was the taking of significant territory in Macedonia. But tied in with that development was the consolidation of the Serbian Slavic tribes to the northwest. While the gradual coming together of a new state in the neighborhood must have been worrying for Presyan, that the Serbs decided to swear loyalty to the Byzantines made this development far more dangerous. Presyan tried to head off this threat by invading Serbia in 839, but the 3-year war only led to disaster as the Serbian troops used the hilly terrain to their advantage and defeated the Bulgars at every turn. Still, Presyan managed to not lose any territory in this endeavor and left the state larger than he found it when he died in 852. His son, Boris the First, however, would prove far more consequential. Now, Boris the First is generally seen as one of the greatest leaders Bulgaria has ever seen, but his reign is full of contradictions. It certainly started off right, with him threatening the Byzantines into granting him a small amount of territory. This would, however, be the only territorial gain of his reign. Soon after, Boris became entangled in a war between Great Moravia and East Francia, two powerful European states at the time. The alliance between the Bulgars and Moravians was a disaster, and the war went nowhere. At the same time, the Croats, yet another Slavic group which had recently united into a single group of people, also fought the Bulgarians. It was the first time the Bulgarian state had ever fought multiple neighbors at the same time, but it would not be the last. Almost immediately after the end of these conflicts, war resumed with the Byzantines, and with Boris still recovering from his losses in the west, Bulgaria lost important territory on its border. Sometime around this period, the timeline is a bit ambiguous, there was also yet another war with the Serbs. If the Serbs were not feeling powerful enough to exist without Byzantine rule, though, perhaps they would do well under the Bulgarians instead. But yet again, the war went poorly. But still, somehow Boris managed to resolve it without losing any territory. Now, at this point, we're beginning to see the early stages of a major problem for the First Bulgarian Empire. Too many warlike neighbors leads to overstretched military resources. Add in the Byzantine ability to always pull an alliance or a deal out of somewhere, and Bulgaria was in near constant danger of a multi-front war. But besides all that warfare, Boris also made the critical decision that Christianity was going to both help unify his subjects as well as bring Bulgaria into the world of European powers. As long as the Bulgarians were pagan, they would always be seen as outsiders to some extent. In addition, conversion to Christianity would continue to tear the royal family apart. The big question was which Christianity, Catholicism or Orthodoxy? This was still centuries before Protestantism came onto the scene. Boris's decision would have massive implications for the future of the country. Now, at first, he leaned towards Orthodoxy, which of course was more familiar to him and his people. but Boris wanted an independent Bulgarian church to allay the fears of his nobility that becoming Orthodox would help lead to Byzantine domination. Finding that hard to get, Boris looked to the papacy in far-off Rome. While things seemed to go better there initially, squabbles over the status of church officials sent to Bulgaria led Boris to soon turn his gaze back to the Orthodox faith. Seeing the chance to build his own church and make it uniquely Bulgarian, he ultimately went in this direction, converting the population and within a few years beginning to replace Byzantine clergymen with homegrown Bulgarians. With this change, besides all the advantages Bulgaria gained, which I've mentioned, Boris went from simply being a Khan or Caesar to being God's monarch, his representative in Bulgarian lands. So in essence, the conversion to Christianity was a geopolitical move which solved many of the problems facing the First Bulgarian Empire in its first 2 centuries of existence. It increased the power and legitimacy of the monarch. It increased Bulgaria's standing on the European stage. And it provided a cultural basis to craft a coherent national identity from the Bulgar and Slav populations. On this last cultural note, whereas Bulgaria had previously used Greek as a written language, the arrival of 2 monks from Great Moravia around this time, Cyril and Methodius, brought the beginnings of a uniquely Bulgarian culture and writing system, which would be established as part of the country's Christianization. With Cyril and Methodius, Bulgaria finally established centers of learning where monks and priests would be trained in Bulgarian Orthodoxy and the emerging Old Church Slavonic language, and as well in the newly created Slavic scripts, first Glagolitic and ultimately after some period Cyrillic. It's this cultural advancement that will play a huge part in allowing Bulgaria to survive centuries of conquest and remain a coherent national idea far into the future. But now back to Boris. He eventually abdicated his throne to become a monk and let his eldest son Vladimir take over. However, Vladimir shared the sentiment of many of the nobles that the conversion to Christianity had been a mistake, and so he led a rebellion to return to paganism. The rebellion, though, was quickly defeated, and Boris blinded his own son to ensure he would never challenge the religious status quo again. Subsequently, a council was held in Preslav, the new capital, to decide what should be done next. The council decided that Boris's 3rd son, Simeon, should rule. Now, as a 3rd son, Simeon had never expected to rule the country and had been trained to be a church official in Constantinople. But he ultimately took to the role as if he was born to it. And that was very opportune because things got very serious for Simeon very quickly, when the Byzantine Emperor started Europe's first trade war by making it nearly impossible for Bulgarian merchants to operate in the empire. When his embassies were ignored, Simeon invaded. While he met next to no resistance, most of the Byzantine forces were far off in the east at this time, diplomacy and geography came into play when the Byzantines allied with the Magyars, the tribe that modern Hungarians are descended from, who invaded Bulgaria from the north. Once he discovered this, Simeon left some forces to protect against the Byzantines and rushed north to the area around the Danube Bend to face the Magyars. However, the Magyars were some of the fiercest warriors medieval Europe had and defeated the Bulgarians twice before pillaging their lands. Still, after peace was reached without any territory changing hands, it was now Simeon's turn to use diplomacy and alliances to pick off his enemies. He reached a deal with yet another steppe tribe, the Pechenegs, to join forces and fight the Magyars. The campaign was decisive, and the defeated Magyars were forced to leave the steppe of what's now southern Ukraine and retreat into the Pannonian Plain, where their descendants live today. Now, Simeon turned to the Byzantines again, wasting no time, and he invaded and headed straight for Constantinople, brushing aside any army sent to meet him. Once at the city walls, he was pushed back by armed Arab prisoners of the Byzantines and agreed to a generous peace treaty. The treaty gave him annual tribute, more territory, and sovereignty over Serbia. Now from this point, Simeon routinely ignored the peace treaty, bullying the Byzantines and taking more and more territory and gold really whenever it was convenient. But he still dreamed of conquering Constantinople and making himself the new emperor. So, when the Byzantines refused to pay his tribute in 913, he gladly took the opportunity to invade. And, well, it was perfect timing. Arab pressure in the east had divided the empire's forces, and a lack of confidence in the young emperor in Constantinople led many inside the city to push for a coup. The Byzantines were desperate, so when the Patriarch of the Orthodox Church took over the government and begged for peace, Simeon agreed on generous terms and lifted his siege. In return for granting the Byzantines reprieve, he received his lost tribute, a promise that the young emperor would marry one of his daughters, and his being given the full title of emperor. Everything seemed to be going well for Simeon, until yet another coup in Constantinople brought a new regent who undid everything which had been agreed to in the treaty, forcing Simeon to invade yet again. He was only brought down with lavish gifts. However, this only stopped him from attacking Constantinople directly. He still raided Byzantine territory at will. But, of course, peace was only ever temporary. In 917, it was time for a war again, as Simeon sought to create a larger anti-Byzantine alliance with the Pechenegs. But Byzantine gold won the day, and the Bulgarians ended up fighting alone. The Byzantines then invaded, moving their army north along the Black Sea coast, keeping their ships and supplies close. Outside of Anchialos, 120,000 soldiers, roughly half Bulgarian and half Byzantine, clashed in what would prove the largest battle of the Middle Ages. The result was a decisive Bulgarian victory. But Simeon still had the Great Byzantine Alliance arrayed against him to worry about. Except that the alliance quickly crumbled. One by one, the Pechenegs, Magyars, and Serbs all failed to materialize to fight Simeon's Bulgaria. The Bulgarian army managed to pursue the Byzantines nearly to the gates of Constantinople, winning battle after battle before returning home triumphant. Now, it was time for Simeon to turn his eyes to Serbia. If you'll recall, the recent peace treaty had placed Serbia under Bulgarian rule, yet its prince had attempted to aid the Byzantines against the Bulgarians. The Serbian prince was captured and spent the rest of his days in a Bulgarian dungeon. All the while, yet another coup in Constantinople shifted the political grounds under Simeon's feet. Now, the new rulers there permanently closed Simeon's planned entrance into the royal family by marriage. War and conquest were now the only paths left for his ambitions. Simeon raided the southern reaches of Greece and even crossed into Asia, and before long he was again at the walls of Constantinople, but still found himself unable to take the city, settling for further brutal raids of its suburbs. But he still dreamed of conquering the great queen of cities on the Bosphorus. To do that, though, Simeon needed a navy, something the Bulgarians had never really invested in. The best one at his disposal was that of the Caliph of the Fatimids. Arab forces agreed, but once again Byzantine diplomacy and gold managed to nip the nascent alliance in the bud. But all this war came at a great cost. Bulgaria was becoming exhausted. Enough that, in spite of his victories, many were willing to actually rebel against Simeon. That rebellion came with Serbian support but was quickly put down, and its leaders beheaded. The elites of Serbia were now dead, and Bulgaria moved to completely annex the territory. This convinced Simeon that his dreams of taking Constantinople couldn't be realized just yet. He met the emperor and made peace, whereby Byzantium would pay a large annual tribute in exchange for an end to the fighting. But Simeon, it seems, just couldn't stop. He used this peace to turn around and make war on the Croatians under their famous king Tomislav. He won that war and prevented a possible Croatian-Byzantine alliance. With this victory, he believed he had another chance to finally take Constantinople, but died of heart failure in his capital Preslav in 927. His reign saw a tremendous flowering of a new Christian and Bulgarian culture. The foundations for the eventual Cyrillic alphabet were laid, and Bulgaria truly came into its own on the European stage. But Simeon's seemingly insatiable personal ambitions also bled his country dry. Decades of near-constant warfare had brought many victories, but those gains were not to last. Simeon's successors would have to fight to the end to hold on to what so much blood had brought. His son Peter the First became emperor, but with a regency owing to his young age. But in spite of this, Peter still began his reign with the sense that he had to prove himself worthy of being his father's successor. And doing that meant war. So his reign kicked off with yet another quick strike into Byzantine Thrace. Fortunately for him, it was successful, and Peter was able to quickly turn this into an advantageous peace. Peace allowed him to marry Irene, the granddaughter of the emperor, and return Byzantine tribute, gaining recognition of the borders that he wanted, as well as Byzantine acceptance of his imperial title. Besides ruling in Constantinople, it was just about everything his father Simeon had wanted. But success never lasted for very long. 3 years later, Peter's brother Ivan continued his uncle's legacy and rebelled, though not for paganism this time. The rebellion was crushed and Ivan was sent into exile. Then, Peter's older brother Michael, who Simeon had forced into a monastery, decided that the monastic life wasn't for him, escaped, and led an even bigger rebellion against his brother. This also failed and resulted in Michael's death. But the setbacks didn't stop there. The Serbian prince escaped his dungeon, returned to his people, and led them to independence against the Bulgarians. Magyar raids added to the difficulties, as Peter no doubt felt beset on all sides from within and without. Still, following these setbacks was about 2 decades of relative peace. Peace Bulgaria desperately needed. During this time, Bulgaria's still young Christianity experienced some changes, notably with the emergence of its most famous saint, John of Rila, or Ivan Rilski, in addition to its most famous heresy, that of the Bogomils. These were a Christian sect which rejected most worldly things and would eventually spread throughout Europe. Now, in spite of all these domestic problems, time passed until Peter's Byzantine wife Irene died and the Byzantine emperor won a great victory over the Arabs. Together, these two events posed the perfect opportunity for the Byzantines to renew their conflict with the Bulgarians. In 966, the Byzantines stopped their tribute and diverted the funds instead to encouraging a new power in the north to attack Bulgaria. In the lands that had once been home to Peter's ancestors 3 centuries earlier, the Kievan Rus had built a powerful state of their own. Promises of conquest and Byzantine gold brought their leader Sviatoslav at the head of an army of 60,000. The Rus found quick victories, one after another, so quickly and completely that the Byzantines actually began to worry that their plan was working too well. A series of marriages and exchanges of hostages between Byzantium and Bulgaria, though, brought a quick peace, while Peter managed to incite the Pechenegs to attack the Kievan Rus and force Sviatoslav to retreat. Just a year later, however, the Rus returned and found yet more victories over Peter's armies and fortresses. The stress got to him, and he suffered a stroke, leading him to abdicate and become a monk, as his grandfather Boris had done. All the same, Peter died within the year. Now, Peter's son Boris II came to the throne, but the poor boy didn't stand a chance against Sviatoslav and the Rus. He bent the knee to his new masters and aided them as they continued their campaign against Byzantium itself. But they were stopped in 970 and pushed back as the Byzantines took the offensive. Soon, Preslav was under siege, defended by Bulgarians and Rus alike. The city burned, and Boris II went from being a captive of the Rus to a captive of the Byzantines. He was stripped of his imperial titles, his imperial treasury, and his imperial lands. But the Byzantines only controlled the eastern part of Bulgaria. The far mountainous wilderness of Macedonia remained independent and ready to fight. One man, Count Nicola, a Bulgarian noble who married the granddaughter of an Armenian king, took charge of continuing the fight against the Byzantines. He and his sons are known by the nickname the Komitopoli, or the Sons of the Count. Nicola and his 4 sons, David, Moses, Aaron, and Samuel, stepped up to rule what was left in Bulgaria in place of the exiled and captured emperor. Each of the four sons ruled a region of what remained of Bulgaria. During the first few years of this arrangement, they attempted to secure the protection and friendship of foreign powers, but no one was interested. In 976, the Byzantine Emperor died, and the four brothers launched a full attack. Soon, two brothers were dead, David killed by nomadic Vlachs, and Moses killed by a stone during a siege in Greece. But Samuil was successful in retaking much of northeast Bulgaria straight across the Danube. Partly in response to these setbacks, a rebellion in Anatolia brought a civil war to the Byzantine Empire. They now had to turn to diplomacy to take off the pressure. Aaron was asked for an alliance and promised marriage to the sitting emperor's brother. He agreed to betray his brother in exchange for the alliance and sole rule over Bulgaria. However, the woman sent to marry him was not, in fact, the emperor's sister, and when this fact was discovered, Aaron wasn't exactly pleased. Yet, despite the treachery, he still created the alliance. When Samuil discovered his brother's betrayal, he rushed down and fought him near Dubnica. Samuil won completely, and only Aaron's son Ivan Vladislav was spared when Samuil's son Gavril Radomir begged for his cousin's life to be spared. Now, Samuil ruled what remained of Bulgaria alone. The Byzantines now tried a new tactic. They still held the last surviving member of the House of Dulo, Bulgaria's centuries-old monarchy, in their captivity. They thought that by releasing him, they could start a Bulgarian civil war, so they allowed Boris II and his brother Roman go. But in those 6 years of captivity, Boris had only ever had daughters, and Roman had been castrated. What was now that house ended in 977 as Boris and Roman approached the Bulgarian border. Boris was mistaken for a Byzantine nobleman owing to his clothing and shot by a Bulgarian border guard. Roman managed to prove his identity and live, but alas, he was castrated and could have no children. Roman was proclaimed emperor nonetheless, but in truth he would only ever be a figurehead. Samuil was the true ruler now. And so Samuil continued his attacks, raiding far south into Greece, laying siege to the great fortresses. The Byzantine Emperor Basil attacked while Samuil was in the south, but failed in his siege of Sredets and lost a major battle at Trajan's Pass as he retreated. This defeat brought yet another civil war to the Byzantines. Basil still sent armies out to fight the Bulgarians, but they too were beaten as Samuil took more fortresses and more territory. But by 989, Basil was victorious over the rebels and prepared for a major attack on Bulgaria in 991. This time, the Bulgarians were defeated and their erstwhile emperor Roman was captured. He would die in captivity 6 years later. But Samuil had escaped and fought on. But the Byzantines always had more fires to put out, and so the Arabs invaded the east and they had to rush and help there. Now, Samuil advanced yet again, winning a huge victory at the Battle of Thessalonica. But soon afterwards, Byzantine and Bulgarian armies met again at a flooded river. The Byzantines crossed in secret and surprised the Bulgarians, leading to a complete rout. Samuil barely managed to escape, sustaining a wound on his arm. His son, Gavril Radomir, only escaped by pretending to be dead amongst the carnage. The two walked 250 miles home. Now Samuil feared yet another Byzantine alliance which would start a war on multiple fronts, which he couldn't hope to win. So he turned to the Serbian Principality of Duklia along the Adriatic coast. The campaign was a complete success. Duklia's prince, Jovan Vladimir, was captured and imprisoned in Samuil's island fortress in Lake Prespa. Samuil moved north along the Adriatic coast, taking fortress after fortress, except for proud Dubrovnik, before moving all the way into Croatia to attack there. Victories in Croatia allowed Samuil to put allies in charge before returning home. Marriages between his family members and the Magyars, the imprisoned Jovan, and a captured Byzantine nobleman seemed to secure alliances throughout the region. Samuil's position seemed strong as the year 1000 came. But Basil welcomed the new millennium even stronger. His rivals were defeated, and he was ready to put a full force of the empire behind the destruction of Samuil and what remained of the Bulgarian state. In 1001 it began. The Byzantines quickly took Pliska and Preslav, along with the regions of northern Greece Samuil controlled. This latter conquest was easy owing to a series of betrayals by Samuil's family and allies. Some cities resisted, but they were no match for Basil. To make matters worse, the Hungarians entered the fray against the Bulgarians in 1003. Samuil's son may have married into the family, but he also backed the wrong successor to the last king. The result was a devastating war against northeast Bulgaria, which further weakened the state. In the subsequent years, Basil led his armies throughout Bulgaria, taking fortress after fortress and convincing one family member after another to betray Samuil. But Samuil kept fighting, avoiding pitched battles where he could and watching his holdings diminish little by little. By 1014, it was obvious that this situation couldn't last forever, and Samuil planned a decisive engagement. The Bulgarians chose to make their stand at Cluj, a mountain pass the Byzantines would have to travel through. But a Byzantine force found its way around the Bulgarians and surrounded and slaughtered them. Around 14,000 soldiers were captured, and 99 out of every 100 were blinded, with the 100th man losing a single eye. This blind army was led back to Samuil, where, upon seeing them, the poor man soon died of a heart attack. His son Gavril Radomir continued the fight, but within a year was killed by his cousin, whose life he had begged his father to spare. Now that cousin, Ivan Vladislav, attempted to keep fighting, but by this point it was hopeless. Within a few years he was killed in a duel while attempting to retake a city on the Adriatic coast. What remained of the Bulgarian nobility could see where things were going, and all surrendered. After 337 years, the First Bulgarian Empire died with a whimper, and was absorbed completely into the Byzantine Empire. So to wrap up, what were the defining challenges of this empire? What really defined it? First, the difficulty of geography. This is an issue which will plague Bulgaria for its entire history. Besides the Danube and some mountain ranges, there are simply too many open areas where foreigners can come in and invade. Speaking of foreigners, this is another of the great challenges facing the state in those early years and throughout its history. Early on, it was mainly the Byzantines, Serbs, Franks, and Avars which posed a threat, but the cast changes tremendously throughout the years. But what does remain constant is the presence of powerful states on Bulgaria's borders, always looking for opportunities to take territory and destroy it. The remaining challenges, however, were actually addressed fairly well during the First Bulgarian Empire. The struggle to create a coherent national identity on which a more powerful state could be built was, far from completed, but was far enough along that within about a century and a half, a Second Bulgarian Empire would be founded. And of course, Bulgaria exists to this very day. All these changes also changed how Bulgaria was seen by outsiders, from barbarian usurpers who had taken on the Byzantine land, to Europeans who in the eyes of their contemporaries belonged on that land. This shift was vital if Bulgaria wasn't going to fade into history as so many other steppe tribes did. Finally, the first decades of fighting between the Khans and the boyar nobles led to crippling instability for the Bulgarian state. The eventual establishment of a powerful monarchy, buttressed by its position as the God-sanctioned head of a Christian state with meaningful Byzantine titles to boot, were essential for the First Bulgarian Empire's thriving and survival. But, as we know, it didn't ultimately survive. And so this wraps up the complex history of the First Bulgarian Empire. If you'd like to hear more, this is covered in a complete season of the Bulgarian History Podcast, one of what will ultimately be 9 seasons covering the entire more than 1,000 years of Bulgarian history. So feel free to subscribe to that wherever you do, and you can check out the website at bghistorypodcast.com. Thanks for listening, and be sure to subscribe and hit that like button. Thank you so much.